Democracy on the Defensive. Europe confronts radical Islam. Written by Rathi Agnihotri. After decades of accommodation, Europe now faces rising public unrest, policy shifts, and political polarization driven by radical Islamist mobilization and the failure of mainstream institutions to confront a liberal ideology early. From anti-Islam rallies to legislative efforts aimed at curbing radicalization, Europe is witnessing a visible shift in public sentiment and state policy. Across several countries, civil society movements and governments alike are beginning to question the long-standing model of multiculturalism that has shaped European political and cultural life over the past few decades. What was once treated as an unquestioned moral framework is now being reassessed in light of mounting security, social, and integration challenges. This reassessment is not occurring in a vacuum. Radical Islamist mobilization in the form of public demonstrations, parallel religious structures, and ideologically insulated urban enclaves has become increasingly difficult to ignore. Practices and demands that would once have seemed implausible in liberal democracies now occupy public space and political debate, raising concerns about the compatibility of certain ideological movements with democratic norms, gender equality, and freedom of expression. The reluctance of institutions to confront these developments early on allowed them to entrench themselves, turning cultural accommodation into structural vulnerability. As Europe grapples with the consequences of this delayed reckoning, the United States appears to be entering a similar phase. Early warning signs, long visible in Europe, are beginning to surface across American cities, campuses, and political discourse. The European experience offers a cautionary lesson. When ideological absolutism is shielded by the language of tolerance, the cost is not social harmony, but deeper polarization and institutional strain. Islamophobia as a shield against scrutiny. Across Europe, the charge of Islamophobia has increasingly shifted from a safeguard against discrimination to a rhetorical shield against scrutiny of radical Islamist ideology. Concerns about extremism, parallel legal structures, and ideological coercion are frequently recast as prejudice, blurring the distinction between protecting individual Muslims and examining a liberal political movements. This reflexive framing has narrowed public debate, discouraging policymakers, journalists, and academics from sustained engagement. As a result, media, academic institutions, and policy think tanks often treat criticism of political Islam as inherently suspect, while applying limited scrutiny to movements that openly challenge democratic norms. Broad dissent is routinely dismissed as far-right or Islamophobic, marginalizing substantive critique and insulating radical actors from accountability. Rather than confronting radicalization, this discourse has frequently obscured it. The political consequences have been significant. Institutional hesitation and silence have intensified public frustration, allowing reactionary movements to dominate issues excluded from mainstream debate. Far from strengthening social cohesion, the weaponization of Islamophobia has contributed to polarization, policy paralysis, and a gradual erosion of democratic confidence across Europe. Islamic radicalization and the reshaping of Europe's political landscape. The noticeable rise of the far right in Europe over the past decade is closely linked to the growing influence of radical Islam. The expansion of political Islam in Europe, including forms that sit uneasily with democratic norms and often adopt confrontational or antagonistic postures, has triggered sustained debate around pluralism, integration, security, and multiculturalism. Several developments have intensified these concerns. These include the growing presence of networks such as the Muslim Brotherhood, often propelled by highly educated immigrant populations, as well as the documented involvement of some European Muslims in transnational jihadist organizations such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Together, these trends have sharpened public anxiety about the national security implications of radical Islam. The increasing visibility of political Islam has also exposed unresolved challenges related to identity, social cohesion, radicalization, and foreign ideological influence. In the absence of clear and effective responses from mainstream political institutions, these issues have created fertile ground for political backlash. Far-right parties have capitalized on this discontent by positioning themselves as the primary voices willing to address concerns surrounding immigration, security, and cultural continuity. As a result, nationalist and anti-immigration platforms have gained traction, not solely as expressions of ideological extremism, but as reactions to a perceived failure of existing frameworks to manage the consequences of radical Islamist influence within European societies. Notably, much of the literature produced by media outlets, academic circles, and policy think tanks, while expressing alarm over the rise of the far right in Europe, remains conspicuously silent on the sharp increase in radical Islamic extremism and terrorism across the continent over the past decade, as well as on the evident reluctance of several European governments to confront this threat directly. Instead, this body of work often collapses a wide range of nationalist and right-leaning voices, including mainstream critics of Islamism, into a single and imprecise category labeled far-right, frequently dismissing their concerns as manifestations of Islamophobia. Anti-immigration movements, which constitute a central element of contemporary right-wing politics in Europe, tend to focus primarily on Muslim migration. This focus is driven by perceptions, whether accurate or overstated, of links between certain migrant communities and radical Islamist ideologies or networks. Public opposition to what is described as Islamization has been visible for nearly a decade. In February 2016, for instance, thousands of demonstrators marched in coordinated anti-Islam rallies across several European cities. Among the most prominent organizers was the German movement Pegida, which mobilized large crowds in Dresden and inspired similar protests in cities such as Amsterdam, Dublin, and Prague. Anti-Islam protests spread across Europe in September 2025. Massive anti-immigration protests rocked London. The Unite the Kingdom rally, organized by UK far-right activist and anti-Islam campaigner Tommy Robinson, drew a crowd estimated in the six figures. The crowd, estimated at between 110,000 and 150,000 people, reportedly clashed with the police, leading to incidents of some officers being punched, kicked, and hit by bottles. The protesters also shouted anti-Islam slogans, as per media reports. Following the protests, videos emerged on social media, where some of the protesters holding British flags could be seen chanting derogatory slogans about Islam and Allah. According to a report by the Jerusalem Post, some of the protesters also waved Israeli and American flags and donned MAGA hats. The protests also reportedly mourned the deadly shooting of the conservative U.S. activist Charlie Kirk. Ireland witnessed a series of anti-Islam and anti-immigration protests in 2025, reflecting rising tensions around immigration, crime, and cultural integration. In July, around 100 demonstrators gathered outside the General Post Office within Irish political leadership, citing Prime Minister Michael Martin's repeated condemnations of Israel alongside a relative silence on the mass killing of Israeli civilians targeted for being Jewish. The article further argues that sections of Irish politics, media, and academia have contributed to the normalization of anti-Semitism by downplaying or excusing radical Islamist extremism. It claims that Hamas is frequently shielded from scrutiny and framed primarily as a political resistance movement, obscuring its record of terrorism and reflecting a broader reluctance to confront radical Islamic ideology directly. Quran-burning rallies and protests have become increasingly common in Europe over the past couple of years, so much so that Denmark has even passed a law banning Quran burnings. However, Europe continues to wrestle with the tension between reviving de facto blasphemy laws and safeguarding freedom of speech. In July 2023, the UN Human Rights Council adopted a resolution condemning Quran burning as a religious hate act. However, 12 states, including European countries such as the UK, France, and Germany, voted against the resolution, citing concerns regarding potential curbs on freedom of speech. The increasing number of anti-Islam protests across Europe is largely driven by public concern over the expanding influence of radical Islam and the crimes and social disruptions associated with it. Rather than emerging in isolation, these protests reflect a cumulative response to a series of developments that many citizens believe have been inadequately addressed by political and institutional authorities. Key drivers include both organized and lone wolf terrorist attacks carried out in the name of Islamist ideology, frequently targeting civilians and public spaces. Rising crimes against women and children, including high-profile cases such as the UK's Pakistani grooming gang scandal, which exposed systemic failures in law enforcement and child protection. Increasingly aggressive public assertion of Islamic political identity, including open demands for the establishment of a caliphate and the imposition of sharia law in parts of Europe. The growing prominence of political Islam in European politics and civil society, marked by widespread pro-Hamas activism in political, academic, and activist spaces, alongside the normalization of anti-Semitic and anti-Israel rhetoric. Together, these factors have fueled public anger and fear, positioning anti-Islam protests as expressions of resistance against radicalization, perceived institutional paralysis, and the erosion of democratic and social norms. Crackdown on radical Islamic extremism. Growing public discontent has compelled authorities to demonstrate visible, decisive responses, signaling a broader shift in Europe's approach to immigration, security, and cultural assimilation. In April 2024, the German government responded with uncharacteristic firmness after an Islamist rally in Hamburg calling for the establishment of a caliphate and the imposition of Sharia law. Then Chancellor Olaf Scholz stressed that Islamist activities would be addressed using the full authority of the constitutional state, underscoring the legal consequences for extremist advocacy. Germany has also banned various Islamic organizations over the past couple of years over their alleged links to Iran, radical anti-women's stance, demands for the establishment of a caliphate, and dissemination of anti-Israel hatred. In July 2021, Austria enacted a stringent anti-terror law expanding state oversight of extremist organizations such as ISIS and the Muslim Brotherhood. It became the first European country to formally ban the Brotherhood's activities and introduced measures to curb radicalization, including mandatory government registration for imams conducting religious services. The UK government has recently placed the Muslim Brotherhood under close review, raising the possibility of a ban under existing anti-terror legislation. According to a report by The National, the government is also likely to remain non-committal on adopting an official definition of Islamophobia, amid concerns that such a definition could be used to introduce de facto blasphemy laws. Many European countries are intensifying restrictions on pro-Palestinian activism amid rising concerns over anti-Semitism. In April 2024, German police shut down the Palestine Congress after organizers allegedly failed to distance themselves from Hamas's October 7 attacks on Israel, though a court later ruled the action unlawful. In France, authorities banned pro-Palestinian protests in 2023, citing risks of violence and anti-Semitic incitement. In 2025, the government ordered the dissolution of Urgence Palestine, a pro-Palestinian group formed in 2023, citing its role in provoking violence, promoting armed struggle, and fueling anti-Semitism. Europe regulating radical Islamic culture bans on Islamic symbols such as the hijab, burqa, and niqab in public spaces remain among Europe's most contentious policy debates. Government efforts to impose such restrictions routinely draw accusations of Islamophobia and human rights violations. France was among the first European states to prohibit the niqab and burqa in public settings. While not comprehensive, the policy applies to several public institutions, including state schools, where hijabs and abayas have reportedly been banned since 2023. The issue resurfaced in April 2025, when a proposed law seeking to ban athletes from wearing headscarves in sporting events triggered major controversy, even as the French Prime Minister reportedly distanced himself from the proposal. In October 2025, Italy's ruling party introduced a bill seeking to impose a comprehensive ban on the niqab and burqa in public spaces. The Brothers of Italy party presented the proposal as part of a wider effort to address what it characterizes as cultural separatism associated with Islam. The draft legislation proposes fines ranging from €300 to €3,000 for violations and includes provisions framed as safeguards for Muslim women, such as penalties for virginity testing and stricter punishments for forced marriages, with religious coercion explicitly recognized as grounds for prosecution. Beyond dress restrictions, the bill targets radicalization and potential terrorist linkages. It proposes enhanced financial transparency requirements for religious organizations that lack formal agreements with the Italian state and authorizes substantial fines for Islamic groups found to accept donations from entities deemed to promote principles that conflict with fundamental freedoms or state security. The paralysis of multicultural politics despite a growing wave of resistance. The fixation on multiculturalism and Islamophobia continues to limit scrutiny of radical Islamist ideologies. As Muslim political representation has expanded across Western countries, Islamist issues have entered mainstream political discourse, enabling radical actors to exert sustained influence within European politics under the protective cover of anti-Islamophobia narratives. In The Strange Death of Europe, Immigration, Identity, and Islam, British author and commentator Douglas Murray examines the prolonged pattern of political appeasement toward radical Islam in Europe from the 1990s into the early 21st century. He documents the rise of political Islam and highlights the ambivalence of European governments toward the cultural and security consequences of large-scale Muslim migration. Through accounts of major attacks and crimes, Murray critiques a media, political environment that often minimized Islamist threats while marginalizing voices that raised concerns. What mainstream politicians and much of the media had in fact done, right up to and throughout the 2000s, was encourage a sense that the people in Europe who were shouting fire were the actual arsonists. Efforts to silence the people who raised their voice, whether through violence, intimidation, or the courts, meant that 3 decades after the Rushdie affair, there was almost no one in Europe who would dare write a novel, compose a piece of music, or even draw an image that might risk Muslim anger. Indeed, they ran in the other direction. Politicians and almost everybody else went out of their way to show how much they admired Islam. Indeed, Denmark's reintroduction of anti-blasphemy legislation to penalize Quran burnings underscores the emergence of the very fundamentalist dystopia that Douglas Murray has warned against. Lessons for America. The United States is now confronting what Europe experienced a decade or more ago. As the number of tightly segregated Muslim enclaves across the country grows, concerns are mounting about the risk of radical ghettoization unless timely measures are taken to prevent the consolidation of parallel social and legal structures. A prominent example is the proposed development linked to the East Plano Islamic Center, commonly known as the Epic City Project and later rebranded as the Meadow Hill, planned in Texas. The project has drawn scrutiny from state authorities and has been subject to multiple investigations, including a criminal inquiry by the U.S. Department of Justice, following allegations of religious discrimination. It has also faced strong opposition from local communities and political leaders, with critics describing it as a proposed Muslim city. Concerns have been raised about the potential exclusion of non-Muslims and the possible informal enforcement of sharia norms. In September 2025, Texas Governor Greg Abbott signed legislation to block the proposed township, arguing that religious freedom cannot be used as a vehicle for segregation under the Texas Constitution. Social and political commentators are voicing growing concern about the expanding influence of Sharia norms and radical Islamist ideology in the United States. Media and think tank reports have raised the possibility of informal Sharia courts operating in parts of the country, particularly in North Texas. In areas with large Muslim majorities, such as Dearborn, critics argue that non-Muslims are increasingly marginalized, pointing to symbolic measures such as street renamings honoring figures linked to extremist causes. Framed publicly as inclusivity and religious accommodation, these developments are viewed by critics as the gradual normalization of parallel legal and cultural norms. In 2023, Minneapolis became the first major U.S. city to permit public broadcasts of the Islamic call to prayer at all hours. In early 2025, Illinois adopted a policy mandating Sharia-compliant meals in government-run schools and hospitals, further intensifying debate over secular governance and civic neutrality. The Trump administration has taken notable steps to curb pro-Hamas networks and protest activity on U.S. university campuses linked to rising anti-Semitism. However, the broader threat of radical Islam remains insufficiently acknowledged. A growing nexus between Islamist actors and influential stakeholders across both the political left and right continues to dilute enforcement efforts, often undermining progress made in countering radicalization. Wrapping up, Europe's ongoing reckoning with radical Islam underscores a broader civilizational challenge facing liberal democracies. Decades of hesitation, shaped by misplaced fears of offense and ideological paralysis, allowed illiberal movements to entrench themselves within democratic societies. The resulting backlash, visible in public protests and policy shifts, reflects not intolerance, but accumulated institutional failure. Europe's experience offers a clear warning to the United States. Delaying scrutiny in the name of tolerance carries long-term costs that are difficult to reverse. Protecting religious freedom does not require surrendering democratic norms or legal equality. The durability of pluralistic societies ultimately depends on their willingness to draw firm boundaries between belief and ideology, accommodation and abdication, inclusion and coercion.